Hey everyone, and welcome back to our texture baking mastery course. Today we are going to be baking some bricks because these have some bump details, so I'm going to show you how to bake both the bump or height map and also how to bake the normal map as well. So first of all, you're going to want to download the procedural brick material in the description, and when you're done you should have something here called brick1.zip. So I'm just going to left click it, and then you can right click it, and then you can choose extract all, and that's going to turn this zip file into a folder with the blend file in it. So I'll press extract all. Here it will ask you where you want to extract the file to. So if you have a certain location where you want to save this premium procedural material, you can press browse and then choose save. Otherwise you can just extract into your downloads folder by just going ahead and pressing extract. Now back in Blender here, I'm just going to go ahead and create my object to bake onto. So I'm going to create a kind of brick wall. Press Shift A, and then under mesh I'm going to choose cube, and I'm going to press S and then X just to scale it on the X axis. I'll left click, and then I'm going to press S and then Z and scale it on the Z axis till we've got a nice wall like this. Maybe I'll make it a bit skinnier, so I'll press S and then Y, scale it down, and now we have a nice kind of wall to put our brick onto. Then we're going to want to add our material to this, so I'm going to left click and drag my timeline to pull it up, and I'm going to change the clock to the shader editor. For some reason in 4.2 it sometimes seems to put me into this line style option, so I'm just going to left click that drop down and change the object. Then we don't actually have our material in our scene yet, so what we can do is press File, and to import something from another blend file we need to use the append import option, so I'll just left click append. And if you remember, we extracted things in our downloads, so here you can see we've got our brick1 folder, so I'll just double click that, and here you can see I've got the brick material here, so I'll just double click that, and then I'm going to choose material, and I'll just left click the brick one and then choose append. Then I can left click this drop down here and choose our brick material. Right now nothing will happen because we need to go into material preview, so I'm just going to left click that, and you'll see right away that our material isn't displaying properly, and that's because in Blender 4.2 everything gets turned kind of black by default, and we need to enable a setting. If you're in Blender 4.1 the colors should be showing fine, and we'll only have a couple of other things to fix. Also we can't see our nodes in here, so I'm just going to left click the view again and then choose frame all. And now we can see our nodes again. So I'll come to my render properties menu here, and I'm going to change my render engine to Eevee, since this material preview mode uses the Eevee render engine. So even if we're not rendering in Eevee, we do need to fix this issue by going into the Eevee settings. Then I'm going to scroll down to ray tracing, and I'm going to check this box to enable it. Then I can change my max roughness to 1. And now you can see it's working properly again. If you're having any issues with this, I recommend just using an earlier Blender version, such as Blender 4.1. I'm going to change my render engine from Eevee back to cycles, since our texture baking process happens in cycles, and that will keep us ready for later. The first thing you'll notice is our bricks looks very distorted, and the first reason for that is because we edited our object in object mode and we didn't apply the scale. It's also going to be important to apply the scale before we UV unwrap as well. First of all, I'm going to show you why it's important to do before UV unwrapping. So I'm going to come up to the top left hand corner, and this cross shape should appear, and I'm just going to left click and hold and then drag, and I'm just going to pull it out to around here. I'll change the editor type from the 3D viewport to the UV editor. Then we can't see our UV, which is normal. I just need to come to my 3D viewport here and press tab to go into edit mode, and if I press A to select everything, you can see our UV in here. As we discussed in the last video, the most optimal UV unwrap for texture baking and texture painting for cube based objects is just to use the Smart UV project option, because it's a little bit more optimized for texture space. So we're going to do that again by pressing A to select everything, U, and then choose Smart UV project, and I'm going to set my island margin here to 0.01 and press unwrap. And you'll notice that we have only squares here, even though we have some rectangle shapes here. You'll also notice how the brick is still looking pretty distorted. There is two things we need to think about here. First of all, our brick shader here is actually using a UV in order to place our material onto the object. The second thing is, because we haven't applied our scale, it's also going to be distorted in the UV editor here too. So let's start off by applying the scale. So I'm going to press tab to come back into object mode. I'm going to press Ctrl A, then I'm going to choose apply scale. Now when I press tab to go back into edit mode, press A to select everything, and then I'll choose U and then Smart UV project. All our settings are the same, so I can just press unwrap. You can see that everything has been unwrapped proportionally, and now everything is at the right scale. But something you'll notice is that we have a lot of visible seams here which we might not want. This is because our UV here is great for texture baking, but not for putting our procedural material onto. As you can see, there's all these gaps, and things aren't going to be lined up properly. So rather than tweaking it manually, we can do a couple of unwraps instead. The first option that might come to mind is to use a cube projection. So I'm going to press A, and then I'm going to choose U, and then I'm going to choose cube projection. And you'll notice that straight away that's looking a lot better. but this is a great quick option. The second option would be to do a seam-based UV unwrap, in which case we can just use the free U method. So I'm going to press 2 on the keyboard to go into edge select mode, and I'm going to left click this edge here, and I'm going to press Control left click to select these seams, or you can just press Shift left click. And what you'll notice is I'm actually selecting 3 kind of U shapes or C shapes in a row like this, and that is pretty much the basics of how you unwrap any kind of cube. I cover this more in depth in my UV Unwrapping for Beginners course, so if you haven't checked that out and you're confused by this, I recommend checking that out. Then we can right click and choose Mark Seam, and then we can press A, U, and then Unwrap. And you can see here, it's created a shape here, which if we look at it from the front where our seams aren't there, you can see everything is connected perfectly. But of course, the only problem with seam-based unwraps is you have unavoidable seams here. So in my opinion, I think we should go for the cube projection, but this is totally up to you. If you do want to go for this option, you might want to change the scale by maybe setting this to something like 2 to double the size. So I'm going to press A, and then I'm going to right click and then choose clear seam. And then I'm just going to choose U and then choose cube projection. And I'm also going to left click my scale here and set it back to 1. Awesome. So that has actually got our brick placed on our material. Let's now talk about the baking. So first of all, the UV we have already is going to work just fine for a texture bake. So we can just leave that as it is, and we don't need to worry about baking onto a second UV or anything like that. Then I'm going to come to my brick wall shader and just show you a little bit more about what this premium shader can do. So this scale will just change the size of everything here. Brick scale will scale just the bricks. Offset, as you can see, changes the alignment of the bricks. I'll change that back to 0.5. Offset frequency controls how often that offset happens. You can see we've got a bunch of settings here which I've added, which you can alter. Even got some details like altering the color noise scale, so I really went to the next level to give you as much control as possible with this shader. Roughness strength here will just control the strength of your reflections. If I press tab to come into object mode, you can see that this brick is quite rough, as it should be. But if you wanted to make it really reflective for some reason, you could turn this down to something like -1. And you can see we've now got a really reflective brick. Maybe this would be good if you're wanting to make your bricks wet or something like that. I'm going to set my roughness strength back to 1. Then we've got our bump strength and brick bump strength. And this just controls the bump effect, which if you don't know, bump is just simulating depth by editing the normals, just like a normal map. We also have scale for X, Y, Z. So I could change the Y scale, for example, to scale the entire brick on the Y axis of this material. I'm going to set that back to 1. UV or object will just choose what type of coordinates work best. As I was talking about, this brick material uses the UV coordinates by default, which is why we went through all that stuff with using the cube projection UV unwrap. I always like to use the UV coordinates for bricks, as object doesn't tend to work too well for the brick texture. As compared to the other procedural built-in textures you get in Blender, the brick texture is only 2D instead of 3D, meaning it doesn't have an extra axis to be mapped across while using the object coordinates, which means it doesn't quite work as well. You can see if I change this to 0 to use the object coordinates, it's only working on the top and the bottom since it's only a 2D procedural texture. I'll change it back to 1 to use the UV again, which we set up. And yeah, that's the basics of how this brick shader works. If you left click this node tree here and I zoom out, you can see we have quite a lot of nodes here which go into making this setup. But again, as I explained in the last texture baking tutorial, this shader here is really all you need to be thinking about, because all of these are pretty much just inputs that are coming into this shader, and this shader is what determines what's going to be baked. So think of it as when we're baking the diffuse or the base color, we're just baking all the information going into this base color slot here. When we're baking the roughness channel, we're just baking everything going into this channel here. And when we're baking a normal map, we just bake everything that goes into there. The only thing that's going to cause us a little bit of trouble is when we are baking the bump map or the height map, in which case we're going to need to combine these two here and plug that into the emission in order to bake it. But we're going to cover that last. So let's go ahead and get started with the base color map or diffuse map. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose image texture. Then I'll go ahead and press plus new, and I'm just going to call this diffuse brick, and we're going to make it 2K again. Width and height, I'm just going to left click and then quickly drag down. And that's going to allow us to edit both these at the same time. I can left click at the end here, press shift and then hold down the 8 key. That's going to add this time symbol, and then we can type in the number 2 and press enter. And now that's changed both of those to 2K at the same time. Then I'll just press new image, and I'm going to make sure my color space is set to sRGB. Then all we need to do is come to our render properties up here, and the render engine we're going to make sure is set to cycles, since texture baking always happens in cycles. Then under render, I'm going to change my max samples to 10, since we're only baking the diffuse channel and we're not baking any lighting information. The viewport samples doesn't really matter, since baking will just use the render samples. Then I'll come down to my bake settings here. If you can't see it, you can just left click it to open it. And I'm going to change my bake type from combined, which should be the default, just down to diffuse, which is for the color. Contributions here, you can see that I've got direct and indirect off. So if you have direct and indirect on, make sure to turn those off. What direct and indirect do is they will add the lighting information from the scene to our texture bake. We only want to bake the color information on the shader and keep things independent from the lighting around it. So I'm going to turn off the direct and indirect for this, and we can keep the color on. Then make sure you have a nice margin, maybe around 16 pixels or so, and then make sure you have your diffuse brick texture node selected here by just left clicking it. Also make sure you have your object selected, and then we can just go ahead and press bake. Now you can see that our texture bake has been generated here on the left. You might need to zoom out if you're quite zoomed in by using the scroll wheel. And now I'm just going to plug it into a second brick wall here just to show you our progress as we go. But before I do that, we're going to need to save our texture just in case Blender crashes, as these image textures won't be saved inside of the Blender file, and rather they need to be saved as their own PNG or JPEG or other image format in your files somewhere. So what I can do is left click this image with a star beside it, and that star just indicates it needs to be saved, and I'll just left click this save button. Then I'm just going to find a suitable location on my computer where I want to store my texture bakes, and I'm just going to left click this plus new folder button, and I'm just going to call this brick 2K textures, and just press enter. Then I'll double click it to open it, and here you can also choose your file format at the top, so I'm going to keep it at PNG, and I'm just going to press save as image to save. Awesome. One thing to keep in mind, if you ever want to rebake your texture, so if you want to rebake on top of this diffuse brick texture by left clicking it and then pressing bake again, maybe if you'd change the color for example, what you would need to do is once that's finished, you just left click image and then just choose save. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to left click my brick wall here, and then I'm just going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and then I'm going to press G and then X to move it along the X axis. And I'll just left click to save its position. Then for this one, I'm just going to press the X beside the brick material just to remove it. And then I'm just going to press this plus new to add a new material. It looks like we've lost our nodes again, so I can just left click view and then choose frame all. Also, if you have a bigger keyboard, there is a home key which you can press, which will take you straight to it. But if not, you can just use the view and then choose frame all. Now let's go ahead and set up these textures. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose image texture, and I'm just going to left click that there. I can then left click this drop down here, and I can choose my diffuse brick 2K from here. Alternatively, you can also press the open button and find it from your file browser. You can also do that by pressing the folder button when you've already added an image, which just does the same thing. I'll press Shift A, and we're going to want to make sure we're using the right coordinates. So under input, I'm going to choose texture coordinate. And since we're using the UV map here to bake, it makes sense that we use the UV coordinates when using this texture map on an object with that UV map. So I'll plug my UV into the vector here, and I'm going to plug my color into the base. Another thing to make sure is that you've got the right color space, so we need the sRGB color space for this texture. And yeah, you can see that our texture bake has worked nice, and now all we need to do is bake the roughness and then the normal or bump. So I'm going to left click my brick again, and I'm going to press the home key just to return to my nodes, or you can go to view and then frame all. And if you like, you can just go ahead and duplicate this, so I can just press Shift D with my texture selected, and I can then go ahead and press the X to remove that. Then I'm going to press plus new, and this time I'm going to call it roughness brick 2K. And since we changed our resolution last time, it's been saved, so it's already set to 2K for us, which is nice. And then I can just go ahead and press new image. Since this is a grayscale image, we're going to change our color space to non-color. And then I'm going to come up to my bake type. All the other settings can be kept the same, as we're not baking any lighting information, so we can still keep our sample count at 10. And I'm going to change my bake type here to roughness. And all this should be fine at the default, making sure I've got a margin here as well as always. And what's going to happen when I press bake is if I left click this node tree button here to go inside, is it's just going to bake everything going into this roughness channel here. And as we know, roughness just controls the clarity of reflections. So I'll left click my roughness brick 2K, and then I'm just going to make sure I've still got my object selected, and then choose bake. Alright, awesome. So our roughness texture bake is done, but something you might notice is this thing is pure white. That means it's just going to be completely rough all over, which isn't what I've actually done in the node setup. So this is actually a mistake on my part. You can see there is a roughness strength parameter here, and earlier I said I'm going to set it back to 1. The default I set for this is actually 0, so that is something you want to be careful when you're making your own custom nodes. Make sure you know what your default values for these things are if you're changing them to avoid making mistakes like this. But thankfully it's very easy to fix. All we need to do is just set this back down to 0, which is the default. Of course, if you do want it to be a bit rougher, you can still set a bit higher, but 1 was a little bit overkill, I think. So I'm just going to set to 0, and then we can left click our roughness brick 2K texture again, and then just choose bake again. Awesome, so now it's finished baking. You can see we've got a much better looking result here, and this actually looks like it has some variation in the roughness between the bricks here and the mortar, which is just the name for the cracks. So if yours looks like a slightly different shade of grey from mine, don't worry, because I think I might have accidentally tweaked the colours while trying to figure out what was wrong with it. So if yours looks slightly different, don't worry, that's fine. As long as you've got a contrast between the brick and the mortar, then you should be all good to go. So let's go ahead and save this image. So I'm just going to left click the image and then choose save. And then I'm going to come to my brick textures folder and I'm just going to press save as image here. Perfect. Let's go ahead and plug this into our object here. So I'll left click my second one here and I'm going to press the home key. I'm just going to give this a name. So where it says material.001, I'll left click it and then just type in brick baked. And I'll left click my image texture here and press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll press the drop down here and I'm going to choose my roughness brick 2K and I'm going to plug my UV into the vector and color into the roughness. Perfect, now it's all hooked up. Then I'm going to left click my brick again and press the home key to return to my nodes. Or again, you can press view and then choose frame all. And again, if you want to take this into another software which uses gloss instead of roughness, we can bake it with an inverted roughness channel. So all we need to do that is first left click the node tree to go inside. And all we need to worry about is the roughness to the last node that was connected. And this noodle here is the only one we need to edit. So I'll press Shift A, then under color, I'm going to choose invert color and I'll just plug that in between there. And right now our reflections are going to be incorrect because of course we're inverting this, and so we're actually turning it into a gloss map, which is not really what Blender works with. It works with roughness instead. Usually if you brung a gloss map into Blender you would have to invert it to turn to roughness, but since we're inverting something which is roughness, it's now turned into a gloss map. And that means when we bake it, we will now have a gloss map which we can use for 3D softwares which don't use roughness. So let's go up by left clicking this arrow button here and we're going to create another texture. So I'll left click this one here, press Shift D and I'll press the X button to delete that and I'll press plus new. Our width and height should still be the same and then we can just type in gloss brick 2K and then I can just press new image. And since it's still a grayscale image, so we need to change our color space to non-color. And then everything should be good to go. So we can just go ahead and press bake. Awesome. And now we can see our gloss here. You can see how it's pretty much just the opposite way around from the roughness. If I left click this drop down and choose roughness, you can see it is literally just the opposite. So I'll change it back to the gloss here and we can go ahead and show you how to plug this in if you did need to use a gloss map in Blender. So I'll press the home key and I'll just left click this roughness texture here and press Shift D to duplicate it. I'll zoom in and in this drop down here I'll choose my gloss. I'll plug my vector into this UV of the texture coordinate, so it's using the UV map, and then I'll plug my color into roughness. Right now this will be using incorrect reflections because it's gloss into roughness, and so we need to invert it first to make it compatible with Blender. So I'll come to the color tab and then I'm going to choose invert color and just plug that in between here. And now our gloss has been turned back into roughness. So to simplify what I've just done here, these two nodes here are the same as this texture here, more or less. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to plug my roughness back into the roughness, as technically it's a little bit better since it has one less node, meaning one less calculation. I'll box select these nodes and just drag them over here, since we're probably not going to use them. I'll left click my brick texture again, and now let's go ahead and bake some normal maps. So first of all, let's create a texture to bake onto. So I can just press Shift A, then under texture, I'll just choose image texture. Then I'll press plus new, and I'll call this OpenGL normal brick 2K. The reason why I've said OpenGL is because the two main types of normal maps, which are OpenGL and DirectX, tend to work with different softwares. So Blender uses OpenGL, so when we bake our normal information, it's going to be OpenGL by default. So that's why I've named it that way. I'll show you how to bake the DirectX as well, just in case you need to use this normal map in a software which uses DirectX by default. So I'll just go ahead and press new image, and color space, even though it's going to create this kind of purpley image, it's still non-color, so I'm going to change it to non-color. And now we should be ready to go for that. I'll then come to my bake settings here. We can still keep our render settings the same at a low sample count like that. And I'm going to change my bake type from roughness to normal. And all these settings we can keep at the default. And just to explain what's going to happen here when I press bake is if I go into my node tree by clicking this, you can see that this purple socket here called normal that is what is going to be baked when we press bake. So all of these nodes that are going into that purple socket are what's going to be turned into our image texture. So I'll press this arrow to go back up. Just before we bake, I just remembered we need to actually save our gloss texture. So you can see how easily it is that even though I've been doing this for years, even I forget to do this sometimes. So don't beat yourself up if you forget to save your texture. So I'm just going to come up to this image with a star beside it, and then I'm going to choose save. I'll come to the location where I want to save it, so just with my other textures here, and I'll just save it as gloss brick 2K. Again, you can choose your file format here if you want to save it as a JPEG or something, but I'm just going to keep it as PNG and then choose save as image. And there we go. Now we should be safe if Blender crashes or if we want to close out of our Blender file. But for our normal, all I'm going to do is left click my OpenGL normal brick 2K texture, make sure I've got my object selected, and then I can just go ahead and press bake. Awesome. And when it's finished, it should look something like this. And as I mentioned, this is the default normal map that Blender works with since it's OpenGL. So if I left click my baked brick object here, I'll just press the home key to return to my nodes, or you can come to view and then choose frame all. I'll left click one of my textures here and press Shift D to duplicate it. And in my drop down here, which is just this little image button, I can choose my OpenGL brick texture. It'll have the correct color space of non-color set up already. And I can left click my vector and plug it into the UV. And also before I plug this in, we'll need to save our image. So I'll come to the top left hand corner, and where it says image with a star, I'll press save. Come to my location where I've saved my other textures, and I'll just press save as image since we have the correct name already. And there you can see the star has disappeared, indicating that's been saved correctly. Then unfortunately I can't just plug this color into the normal, as that's not going to work properly. We need to give it something to work with first. So I'll press Shift A, and then under vector I'm going to choose normal map, and this is going to allow us to use this texture with our shader. So I'll plug the color into the color, leave the strength at 1, which is just going to use it totally, and then I'll put the normal into the normal, and you can see now we now have the depth detail too, and it's pretty much starting to look like the same material. But as I mentioned, there's another type of normal map called a DirectX normal map, and this might be needed if you're using these textures in another 3D software which doesn't use OpenGL normal maps but uses DirectX normal maps instead. So to do this, I'll just left click my other brick, and I'll press view and then frame all to come back to all my nodes, and I'll just left click one of my textures and press Shift D to duplicate the image texture, left click the X to remove the texture, and we'll create a new one. So I'll press plus new, and I'll call this DirectX normal brick 2K. I'll keep the width and height at 2048, and I'll just choose new image. Then we want to make sure our color space is set to non-color, and now this is all good to go. So how are we going to make it a DirectX normal map? Well, a DirectX normal map compared to an OpenGL map has only one difference. The green channel, or the Y channel, is flipped. So thankfully, Blender makes this really easy for us. If I want to bake this as a DirectX, I can come to my bake settings, and under influence, you can see that we can change the XYZ here. So I can just change the green or Y channel to -Y, and that's just going to invert the green channel when it's baked, turning it into a DirectX normal map. So now I've done that, I'll just make sure I have my DirectX normal brick selected, make sure our object is selected, and then I can go ahead and press bake. Awesome, and now that's been baked successfully. If you look closely, you can see that it kind of looks a little bit different from the normal map. I'll just choose the drop down here to show you the difference. You can see how they look inverted here. So I'll choose my DirectX normal map again, and we're going to want to make sure we save it. So I'll left click the image and then choose save or save as, and I'll come to my folder where we now have quite a nice collection of brick textures here, and I'll just keep the name the same and just choose save as image. Now if Blender crashes or we quit, our textures will be safe. I'll left click my baked brick model here, and I'll press view and then choose frame all to see all my nodes again. And I'm now going to show you how we can set up the DirectX normal map if you ever do get a DirectX normal map which you need to use inside of Blender. The reason we need to do extra steps is because, like I mentioned, DirectX is not the default which Blender works with. Rather, Blender works with OpenGL normal maps by default, which means when we use a DirectX normal map in Blender, we need to invert the green channel in order to turn it into pretty much an OpenGL normal map. So I'm just going to left click and then shift left click these two nodes and press Shift D to duplicate them. I'll then left click and drag this vector and plug it into the UV, so we're using the right coordinates. And I'll zoom in here and I'm going to change it from the OpenGL normal map to the DirectX normal map. If I plug this in just now without changing anything, you can see it's going to look like the bricks are being pushed inwards and the mortar is being pushed out. So you can see why it's important that we do need to fix this. So as I mentioned, we need to invert the green channel. And when we were baking, that was really easy. We just needed to switch a quick setting to get our DirectX normal map. But to convert a DirectX normal map back into an OpenGL normal map while using it in our shader, we do need to use a couple of nodes. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under Converter, I'm going to choose Combine XYZ, and I'm going to press Shift A again, and then under Converter, I'm going to choose Separate XYZ. Now, as I mentioned, it's the green channel that's flipped, but green and Y are pretty much the same thing. So you can use either XYZ or the RGB, whatever you prefer. For this example, I'm going to use this. So I'm going to plug my color into the vector, and the X will plug into the X, the Y will plug into the Y, and the Z will plug into the Z. Then I'll plug my vector into the color. And after doing that, absolutely nothing will change. And that's because we're essentially saying, take this, separate it out into its three components, take it back into its three components, and then put it back into it. So pretty much this node setup is the same as just plugging the color into the color. But the reason we've done this is because we need to invert the Y channel or the green channel. And so since we've now got a noodle here, we can add an invert node in between these. So I'll press Shift A, and then under color, I'm going to choose invert color and plug it in between the Y. And there we are. Now you can see it's been fixed. So if you need to use a DirectX normal map inside of Blender, that is how we can do it. I'm going to start making things a little bit more organized here. So I'm just going to left click and drag these nodes. And if you remember, we can press Ctrl and then J to put a panel around it. And here in the node options here, we can give it a label as well. So I'm just going to call it DirectX Setup. And I can just drag that over here. But we're going to want to use our OpenGL setup. So just left click and box like these, press Ctrl J, and I'll give this the label of OpenGL Setup. And I'm going to plug that into the normal like that. And I'm going to move my DirectX setup over with the gloss setup we made earlier. You can go ahead and organize all these other setups as well if you would like to. It does help keep things more organized and clearer to understand. Finally, let's go over how we can bake the bump. So I'm going to left click my brick texture here. Then we can't see our nodes, so I'll just press View and then choose Frame All. And I'm going to zoom in to my nodes here, and I'll just left click one of them, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it. I'll press the X to get rid of this texture that's in it just now, and I'll press plus new, and I'm just going to call this height brick 2K. I'll keep my dimensions at 2048 by 2048 to make it 2K, and then I'm just going to choose new image. This is also a grayscale image, so I'm going to choose non-color for my color space. And now we just need to go into our node tree here and set some things up. The reason why is because if I come over to my bake settings here, you can see I don't have any height options here, which means we need to bake it using another parameter. Usually the best one to go for is emit, and I'll show you why. So you can see that my normal setup here is made up of 2 bump nodes. Thankfully, it's nothing more complex than that, as sometimes you will be dealing with a lot more bump nodes, in which case I would be much more willing to throw in the towel and just probably bake the normal map. But if you really need the height map, you could still do it technically. So I need to put these 2 inputs in the height of these bump nodes, and then I need to plug them into something called the emission. I could just plug it into the emission color here, and then when I set my bake type to emit here, it will allow us to just bake that emission, which is going to bake us a height map. So first things first, let's press Shift A, and then under color, I'm going to choose mix color. And we're going to need to find our height inputs. So here's one here, this noise texture. I'll just plug that into socket A, and then we can follow the other one here, and you can see that's this brick texture here. So I'll plug that into there. And right now, to show you what this is looking like, temporarily, I'm going to plug in my result into this brick wall shader, which is just going to take it to the output. If I zoom in, right now, you can see it's kind of mixing between the two, but it's kind of just taking an average of the two. And you can see as I change the slider, it's going to use one or the other. So 0 for the first input and 1 for the other input. And 0.5, we'll take it so it's in between. So what I'm going to want to go for here is a perfect blend between the two, so I'll keep it at 0.5. But we still have one problem, and that's that if you look at my bump node here, this channel here was inverted, meaning the height has been flipped. So this node here is the same as this B socket input here. So all I need to do is add an invert node between this B socket and the input for the height. So I'll press Shift A, and then under color, I'll choose invert color and just plug it in here. And now you can see, if you understand how the colors represent what's going to be protruding and what's not, you'll see this makes a lot more sense. This is because the areas that are whiter or closer to 1 are going to be the areas sticking out, and the areas that are darker or closer to 0 are going to be the parts which are more inward. And that makes sense since the mortar or the cracks are going to be deeper in, whereas the bricks themselves are going to be pushed out. Then next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to left click this clamp result checkbox, This is a bit of a technicality, but pretty much it's going to make sure that the output is between 0 and 1, meaning we won't have any issues. Although there is a chance that maybe baking automatically clamps anyway, but I'm not too sure on that. So I'll clamp it just to be safe. Then I'm going to plug my mix result into my emission color, since this is what we're going to be baking, and we'll keep our strength on 1. If you want to get a slightly more accurate result, you could actually bake these as 2 separate height maps and then combine them with bump nodes like we've done here. Then I'm going to plug my BSDF into the brick wall shader, and right now you're going to see it's going to kind of glow, and that's because we've plugged it into emission temporarily in order to do this height bake. So I'll then left click this arrow to go up, and since we've already created our height brick texture, I'll just left click it, and then I can go ahead, make sure my bake type is set to emit. All these settings should be fine, so I can go ahead and just press bake. Awesome, and now you can see on the left here we've got a nice height map ready to use. And so the reason why you might want to make this rather than a normal map is, one, you can use it for other things such as a displacement, for example, and of course you can use it with your bump node, which will have a slightly more detail than your normal map. The only caveat with that though is that normal maps tend to be a little bit faster, but it's great to have the option. So I'm going to then come to this image button and then choose save. I'll come to the location in my computer where I've saved my other textures, and I'm happy with the name, so I'll just choose save as image. And now we need to fix our shader here. So what I can do is I can go into my node tree by left clicking this, and I'm just going to go ahead and unplug this from the emission socket, and now everything is back to normal. I'll press this arrow to come up, and now let's go ahead and try and set up this bump on the other object. So I'll left click this baked brick, I'll left click the view, and then choose frame all to see all of our nodes. This time I'll just left click one of my textures and press Shift D to duplicate, and I'll plug my UV coordinates, my texture coordinate, into the vector, and I'm just going to drag it down here and zoom in, and I'll press this drop down here, and I'm going to switch it to the height brick. Again, if you don't have it in your blend file, you can just press this folder button to open and find the height. Then I'll press Shift A, and then under vector I'm going to choose bump, and I'm just going to plug my height into here, and then I can plug my normal all the way up into here. Use this to replace the normal map. You can see straight away we have a lot more detail. So with this one we might want to turn down the strength a little bit, so maybe I'll change it to something like 0.2 or maybe something like 0.35. And there, that looks quite good. So you can see how I'm getting quite a lot more detail around here. So if that's kind of what you're going for, then this can be a good option. Again though, to get the most accurate result with a bump, I recommend baking 2 height maps and then combining them with 2 bump nodes. However, I'm not going to do that in this tutorial, but in the next tutorial, just in case you want to learn how to do that. But yeah, for now, that just about covers it. Well done in completing this baking lesson. It was quite a long one, but I hope you got some value out of it and some good practice. Feel free to share your results in the community, as I would love to see how you're getting on with this course. But apart from that, I'd like to thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next installment of this course. Take care.